Hello and welcome back to continuing coverage of the Magic the Gathering World Championships here in Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm Tim Willoughby, this is Simon Gertson, and we have more standard constructed for you from our feature match area. An interesting match that we've got coming up here from one of the players who is best known for his performances in standard. We're going to get a chance to see what Brad Nelson has brought to the table this round, and this is the round as well where the players have had access to all of the deck lists. So from here on out in the tournament, when it comes to constructed, these players will have had a chance to look at the decks that are being worked with from their opponents, and that means that when it comes to really high-level play, we can expect to see no surprises, lots of very, very carefully worked out lines of play. If anything, the best that we could hope to see in any kind of constructed standard. And here we have Wyatt Darby. He's up against Brad Nelson here. Wyatt Darby, we saw in the feature match area a little bit last round. He's on red-black aggro. In some respects, one of the more known quantities in the field, but also arguably the most powerful deck in the field, Simon. The one that we've seen a lot of people bring on the other side of things, though. Brad Nelson, we know that he likes to innovate. What has he done for this tournament?
He is bringing Reservoir Combo, the paradoxical outcome combo deck with Sai, Master, Thopterus. And I'm actually surprised. That is a deck that is certainly powerful, but it's not a deck that I would associate with Brad Nelson at all.
And again, this might be a case of one of the real careful metagamers in this event having potentially found a chink in his opponent's armor by having a surprising deck to bring to the table. Starting things off with a Renegade map on turn one off a basic island. A lot of basic islands for Nelson to be working with here. And early doors in this game, he's just kind of setting up, getting lots of almost sort of nothing artifacts in play in some respects, but what's his big payoff?
So the card you want to look out for is Paradoxical Outcome, to return all these artifacts to his hand and draw a bunch of extra cards. And that is usually only possible once he has an Inspiring Statuary on the battlefield.
Inspiring Statuary there, you can see it, giving non-artifact spells improvise. So that Prophetic Prism, that Renegade map, suddenly they get to tap for the colorless mana requirements on colored spells, meaning that you can kind of, for lack of a better term, storm off, cast a lot of spells in one turn, and that works very, very well with the card that we've referenced in the title of this deck, Reservoir Combo. We're talking about Aetherflux Reservoir.
Yeah, and Aetherflux Reservoir is actually the win condition. So this is not really part of the combo, but more the way to close out the game to actually win, gain almost an arbitrary amount of life and kill the opponent from there.
And I guess that life game pretty good against the red-black aggro deck that's being played by Wyatt Darby here. But in the early turns of this game, he's also able to find Sai, Master Thopterus, which combines very nicely with lots of artifacts. Mox Amber coming down, will tap for blue thanks to Sai being in play. Also, though, generating Thopters with each and every artifact being cast.
Yeah, and that alone is a win condition. And if Wyatt Darby with his red-black aggro deck doesn't spend a turn getting rid of Sai, then he's just losing to this army of Thopters potentially.
Yeah, cut there, the removal half of Cut to Ribbons, dealing with Sai Master Thopterus before things can get too crazy. I love the addition of Sai Master Thopterus to assorted artifact decks that we've seen. It means that while we can reasonably call Brad Nelson's deck a combo deck, sometimes it does just get to play a more straightforward beatdown role, just simply by doing the operations it would be doing anyway. Well,
you're just diversifying your game plan.
Doesn't require a huge amount of extra investment in the deck to change things up to fit Sai in. Sometimes means that you can win one way, but the other side of things, you can just gradually manipulate way, draw things out and get into what you need there with Reverse Engineer there, an improvised spell to draw some cards. And for the second round in a row, it feels to me like Wyatt Darby has been forced into a relatively reactive role with a deck that's not really at its best when it's sat on its heels.
Well, red-black aggro can play an aggressive game. It can also play a mid-range, even somewhat of a control game. The problem is against Reservoir Combo, you want to be the one applying pressure. The life totals at 2020 is not a good sign for Brad.
Yeah, the first
for Wyatt Darby.
Yeah, the first real threat of the game here for Wyatt Darby is Chandran Torture Defiance coming down here, immediately ticking up, making mana to cast that Scrap Heap Scrounger. The Scrounger, it can't block, but very, very good on attacks. And for Nelson, in some respects, he's already got over one of the biggest hurdles in this matchup, which is he's got through to the mid stages of this game without taking a substantial amount of damage.
Any damage at all, in fact.
That Thopter token able to attack in the air and do a point of damage to Chandra. Not that the Scrap Heat Scrounger could have blocked anyway. And here is Aetherflux Reservoir. So in principle, Wyatt Darby will have meaningful interaction in game one with this because he's likely to have a Braid in his list. But being able to just play that Reservoir without needing to be going off, a pretty good sign for Brad Nelson that things are going well.
Yeah, I can confirm that Wyatt has 3 Braids available to him. But like I said earlier, killing Aetherflux Reservoir is actually not the best thing you can do in the matchup. Inspiring Statuary is the card you really care about, and then something you can't abrade is Paradoxical Outcome, which Brad is desperately looking for. He actually has a bunch of islands in his hand.
18.
Yeah, in terms of what's going on for Nelson, essentially all of the action in play for him. His hand very unexciting indeed. 3 islands and Ornithopter, which serves kind of a weird role in this deck. 0 mana creature, it's not going to be attacking, but what it does do very well is get cast and recast when you've got the likes of Paradoxical Outcome in play, and that means that Aetherflux Reservoir triggering a lot of times.
Goblin Chain Roller, by the way, really good against Thopter tokens generated by Sai.
Trigger, gain 1 life.
Speaking of which, here is Sai. The timing's on that working rather better for Brad than for Wyatt Darby, and this is where casting that Ornithopter working out rather nicely. Gets to cast the Ornithopter after Sai, gets an extra value token, and of course he's casting multiple spells in the turn, gaining life off that Aetherflux Reservoir. At some point it's going to work out that Brad Nelson's board is almost too busy to fit all of the permanents that he needs in play, but at that point, maybe he'll cast Paradoxical Outcome and pick them all back up again.
Yeah, the most interesting thing, I believe, is the ability to maybe sacrifice a few artifacts to draw some extra cards. Now, Brad doesn't want to sacrifice too many permanents because otherwise a top deck Paradoxical Outcome wouldn't really help him too much. But at the same time, he wants to be blocking anyway. However, I expect Darby to kill Sai before blockers.
Yeah, looking at the cards available to Darby in hand, Karizev, Skyship Raider, Chandra, Torture Defiance, Hazaret the Fervent, and another Cut to Ribbons. These cards, many of them not matching up super well against what's going on the other side of things. That Chandra, well, there's already one in play. Karizev, at this point, it's a little late in the day for the 1/3 attacker. Cut to Ribbons, though, is again going to be a good answer for Sai.
Yeah, and this is the key decision by Brad. Does he activate Sai in response? And if yes, what does he sacrifice? How much does he sacrifice? What is the winning line going to involve here?
And you can bet that Brad Nelson has got a lot of reps under his belt with this deck. He is a relentless tester when he knows that he's got a lot on the line, and there's very few tournaments that happen ever in the history of Magic that have more on the line than this World Championship.
Draw card.
So Renegade Map getting sacrificed there to draw a card alongside a Thopter token. And then Sai goes away. So maintaining that key permanent count just a little bit there.
11.
Attacks dropping Brad down to 11 there. 6 points of damage coming through. No blockers for Brad. He'd rather keep the Ornithopter in play than simply have it represent 3 more life.
Yeah, and the problem here is that 11 is very likely to be lethal, depending on Darby's hand. So Brad cannot assume that he's just going to survive the next turn.
Yeah, he needs to cast a number of spells if he's going to get things going with Aetherflux Reservoir. Prophetic Prism, a very good start because this artifact does draw you into another artifact just as soon as you cast it. A fair amount of mana available, as we've already seen for Nelson, so it's just going to be a matter of what he can do with it all. Is this the turn for Inspiring Statuary? Yes, it is. Now, all of those artifacts in play, they can get tapped to play the colorless costs of spells, but Brad Nelson, he's laid his hand on the table. He's deep in thought here. This is not just a straightforward going on through the motions business here for the former Player of the Year.
No, Brad needs to survive the next turn, and he needs to chop deck Paradoxical Outcome if he wants to win this game.
2 cards remaining in hand, and Nelson carefully surveying a very threatening board on the other side of things. Ether Hub, one of the ways that this red-black deck has access to black mana more easily, and there's also 2 copies of Ribbons in the graveyard. Still more ways that potentially Darby can eke out the final points of damage if he so needs.
I think the Ornithopter is playing the crucial role here. If Ornithopter survives, it's blocking Hazoret, which is huge. If Ornithopter dies, I think that Darby is going to find lethal here.
Well, goes for casting this Heart of Kieran. That means there's not so much mana left over. Karizev getting cast as well. Lots of creatures in play here for Darby. He has some big swings. He's managed to get down to just the 1 card in hand so that Hazoret the Fervent can attack. And it looks like Brad Nelson is going to be able to line up blocks here.
Yeah, and he is not even attacked for lethal. Chandra has already been activated, so he knows that he has this 1 top deck to maybe get there.
It's a big draw. What has he found? I believe it's another copy of Inspiring Statuary here.
Gain 1.
Oh, okay, Prophetic Prism. That's another spin of the wheel.
Redraw.
I mean, almost any colored spell here would be good for him, but it looks like that not the draw he was looking for. Wyatt Darby picking up the first game here. These players at 2-2 need to get into that sort of positive range in this first day of our World Championship competition. And Darby with his red-black list doing things well. And you can see these players both getting the opportunity to have a look at the list of their opponent as they make their adjustments before game 2.
Yep. You need to find paradoxical outcome at some point, and Brad just didn't.
All right, so these players, they're going to be going to their sideboards. They're going to be having a bit of a think about what to do for their second game. We're going to have a think about what they might do too, while you guys are going to get a chance to see these messages.
Show off your love of Magic the Gathering with premium statues from Prime 1 Studios. Each figure stands 28 inches tall and is carefully sculpted in high-quality resin. Pre-order yours today at SideshowCollectibles.com.
Hello and welcome back to this round 5 of the World Championship here in Las Vegas, Nevada. The format that we find ourselves with at this stage in the competition is standard. These players, they've had the opportunity to take a well-explored environment and really try and dig deep into the metagame in order to find the perfect deck. They know the exact lists of their opponents, but there have been some interesting choices made, even with some of the more established decks in terms of where cards are sitting between main decks and sideboards. There are some players that have maybe brought a few cards into their main deck that might traditionally be considered sideboard cards in order to get an edge on this competition. And I'm really intrigued to see how the different kind of metagame shimmy being operated by Brad Nelson, that of taking a deck a little bit outside his regular range in the paradoxical outcome Storm list, is going to work out for him against the likes of Red-Black Aggro. Red-Black Aggro in the hands of Wyatt Darby did great work in game one. Nelson not quite able to assemble all the key combo pieces that he needed. Will we see the same again in game two, Simon?
Oh, I hope not, because it wasn't so much Black-Red doing great things. It was more the blue combo deck stumbling. Any kind of creature deck would have beaten the blue deck at that point. And like I said before, you need to do a bit more than cast 2 Sais and a few artifacts.
These players just finishing their shuffling there. They will have made a few adjustments. The starting 60, of course, 15 cards that they can make little changes from. Any key cards that we should be looking out for from these sideboards to potentially change things up?
So Wyatt Darby will have more control elements, more disruptive elements after sideboarding. He already has 2 Doomfall in the main deck, but there are a bunch of Duresses, maybe an Angrath from the sideboard. He can cut a lot of the removal spells, at least the removal that doesn't deal with Sai, Master Thopterist.
And when it comes to thinking about this red-black aggro list, a lot of what the black is all about are these disruptive elements, especially out of the sideboard. It's really in preparation for game two in some respects that there's black mana available to this deck almost at all.
Yeah, it's mostly a mono-red deck in the main deck, that's true.
On the other side of things, Brad Nelson there, we can see there, just considering his opener, especially with a combo deck, having to take a mulligan can really sting. The sort of finding the key cards, very, very important, but you kind of also need critical mass.
Similar to Ken Yokohiro with his mono-blue aggro deck, Brad is not looking to transform his deck too much against red-black aggro. And that makes sense because he chose this deck for this metagame, so he thinks it's well-positioned against red-black.
Now, looking at the hand that Wyatt Darby's been working with here, he kept a hand with an awful lot of land, relying on this early Scrap Heap Scrounger and potentially a Glory Bringer here in Game 2. Are those the kind of cards that really excite you in this matchup, Simon?
No, absolutely not. I think that is not what you want to see. You want to see, wow, those disruptive cards.
This is the kind of start that we did not see from Brad Nelson in Game 1. Sai getting to do a huge amount of work thanks to Mox Amber, 2 copies of Ornithopter. That's 3 Thopters coming into play alongside the 1/4 legendary creature itself. Brad Nelson, if Wyatt Darby was planning on just attacking him with creatures, it's going to take a lot of attacks before he actually gets through to Nelson's life total.
Yeah, and Brad knows that this was a huge turn 3 for him.
I mean, even just having a 1/4 in the face of the 3/2 Scrap Heap Scrounger, just with nothing else going on, would have been okay. It wouldn't have been exciting. I don't know even whether or not Brad would have been looking to block with it. But as things stand, he's just got creatures in play for days here.
Yeah, it's very likely that Brad doesn't want to block with Sai, because if he gets to untap with it, suddenly he has this ability to just block with his Thopters and sacrifice them to draw extra cards. He is, however, protecting his life total here, which is also a fine choice.
PNLR coming down for Wyatt Darby. He gets a Thopter of his own off the legendary creature. The red-black list almost feeling like it's kind of the story of the Nalar family on Kaladesh between Pia, Hearts of Kiran, and of course Chandra, Torch of Defiance. All key pieces in this red-black list.
Yeah, working well together too.
And inspiring statuary as well here for Brad Nelson. If he's got one of the key hallmark blue spells in his list, he could basically do everything that he needs to here. Not that he's even under any pressure to.
No, gets in for 1.
Wyatt Darby very much on the back foot here, currently playing as mono-red. That's not going to hurt him too much. If he needs the black mana, he's got an Ether Hub in hand rather, to play when he needs to. And as things stand, he's just going to have to try and find some way to batter through this colossal number of blockers on the other side of things.
Darby is actually looking to Glory Bringer, and that is probably getting exerted next turn to deal with Sai, Master Thopterist.
Wyatt Darby attacking him with 1 Thopter, offering the trade, and it's one that Brad Nelson content to take. A cycled land there for Darby, just trying to improve his draws slowly but surely here. He finds he's got Bomat Courier to work with. And given that he knows that he's going to have 5 mana next turn, might as well even play a haste creature after combat.
I mean, Bomber Courier is actually pretty weak on this board. He couldn't really deploy it with Psy on defense. Also, the 1/1 Thopters are a disaster for the Courier.
And here is a big paradoxical outcome for Brad Nelson. He picks up a lot of permanents, but none of those permanents really cost him too much mana apart from the Psy itself. And in turn, he gets to draw into a lot more cards, which means that if we thought that the turns we saw so far from Brad Nelson were explosive, if anything, they should be even more so now.
Yeah, and of course, Psy is Psy and Paradoxical Outcome, the blue, or I should say the non-artifact spells in Brad's deck. So there's going to be exactly what we see here, the artifacts, the remaining artifacts for Brad paying for Psy so that he can deploy more artifacts afterwards.
Now, worth noting with Inspiring Statuary, it's not as if the artifacts that come into play have any kind of summoning sickness when it comes to paying for spells. Brad, he can just start playing an artifact, generating an additional Thopter. Then those artifacts can get tapped to cast colored spells rather, and just sort of work his way through and generate a huge amount of velocity. Navigator's Compass there. That, a relatively harmless looking artifact in abstract, but life gain good against this red-black list, and then on top of that, of course, it is effectively a free mana source. Mox Amber got all the better with the addition of Psy Master Thopterist. It can tap for blue mana now, rather than just being relegated to doing things with Inspiring Statuary. And this is where things really start going off. Being able to use Reverse Engineer to draw into still more cards. Drawing 3 cards at the low cost of effectively 2 mana, really, with the Improvise going on there.
You got to look at Darby's face there. I think he knows the writing is on the wall.
Yeah, he maybe dodged a bullet a little bit in game 1 with Brad not drawing all the pieces of his combo he needed. But you know what? This time around, he's going to do well to get out of this situation. Brad really struggling to find space on his battlefield now for all of the permanents that he's putting into play. It's not going to take him very long to close this game out, just with Thopters here.
So how many of those guys are right there?
I have 5 untapped and 2 tapped.
Nelson there, not even really showing quite how exciting his board is in his tone of voice, just all business. And here comes Glorybringer. The big dragon.
Nope.
Second.
Getting stopped by commits there, so getting put down a little ways from the top of Wyatt Darby's list, but Wyatt Darby's deck there. He's going to have to wait on the dragon, and I don't know whether or not he's going to have time to wait on it because of everything that Brad Nelson has going on here.
We might actually see the memory side of commit to memory very soon here. Drawing 7 fresh cards when you can pay for your spells with by tapping artifacts.
Yeah, only having to pay 2 real mana, as it were, to be able to cast memory. Recycling potentially the 2 key big blue spells in the graveyard already for Brad Nelson.
Yeah, there are 2 downsides to memory, which is it's symmetric. Both players get a fresh 7, and you are the one spending that much mana in your main phase. So in most instances, you have to pass the turn with a full grip, but tapped out. In this particular situation, you can actually tap 2 islands and still have most of your mana available for whatever you want to be doing.
Navigator's Compass, effectively casting it mana generation there, given that you get both the Compass itself and a Thopter. Mox Amber getting tapped, and then another Mox Amber being played here. So the legend rule means you can only have 1 Mox Amber in play at a time, but no massive surprise there that the Mox Amber being kept around is the untapped one. We see an errant Brian Brown-Doin token on the battlefield there, suggesting that Brad might be getting close to exhausting all of the Thopters in our feature match area. Definitely something within the range of this Reservoir Combo deck. Brian Brown-Doin, a former world champion and teammate of Brad Nelson's. Commit has already been cast. Memory on the Aftermath side of things. For just 2 mana, these players both shuffling in their graveyards. The copy of Glorybringer that was close to the top of Wyatt Darby's deck now could be absolutely anywhere. And drawing 7 cards when you're a combo deck, feeling pretty great.
Yeah, and Brad wouldn't even mind Darby recasting Glorybringer. At this stage, it's really just, does he find what he needs to find to close out this game.
We should count spells, though, I guess.
You can hear the talk of counting spells. That because Aetherflux Reservoir, when it comes into play, all the spells that happened prior to it in the turn, they've still been cast, and the subsequent spells that you then cast will be gaining you more and more and more life based on how many spells have been played in the turn.
Yeah, don't forget those last Palais Navigator's Compass, the second Mox that Brad played.
Yeah, at least 3 spells played already this turn, and
Spells, land has been played.
Brad there also making clear that he'd already played a land. When you suddenly draw a lot of extra cards, it's easy to lose track on something like that. Typically, normally in a regular game, you just play a land at pretty much the start of your turn. A little more complicated when your hand changes that much.
To you, and then if you want me to go through it, no actions are being made currently because I'm missing triggers and stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
All right, I'm going to play this. I'm going to get a trigger. And then
can you show me an outcome? I'll scoop some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Outcome of-
So there we see Brad Nelson kind of shortcutting through things a little bit there. Aetherflux Reservoir when he's got plenty more spells to be able to cast there in order to be able to secure the game win. Wyatt Darby not forcing him to go through lots of motions there. He just wants to have enough time to make sure that game 3 can be a real game.
Yeah, and because Brad had already cast so many spells, he didn't actually need much for, on top of the Reservoir there.
Not at all. And when you've just drawn that many extra cards, easy to imagine that you'll be able to find them. You can see a few more players in our feature match area. Former world champion Seth Manfield on the back table there up against Martin User. We may get a chance to see a little bit of that one potentially, depending on how this one plays out. But the players, again, will be looking to their sideboards. And this time round, it will be Wyatt Darby who's on the play. How much is that likely to change the energy of this final game?
I think it's really important to be on the play because it's a pure race. You have a Sai, which is adding a bit of a combat dimension to the matchup. Before Sai, it was really just, can I race the paradoxical outcome quickly enough? And once again, we still haven't seen Darby really disrupt what Brad is trying to do. So I'm looking for those duresses, I'm looking for those braids at a key moment.
We're going to get a chance to have a quick look in on that other game that we saw on the back table there, just to, give a little bit of a variety here. Seth Manfield and Martin User had kind of a rocky start in this tournament thus far. Manfield going to be in the playoff to be Player of the Year later on this year. But first up, he's got this World Championship to worry about. Previously, the World Championship been very kind to him, but after kind of a rough draft, he finds himself at 1-3 up against the Hall of Famer Martin User here. These two players. Let's have a look at the decks that they are working with. User is on blue-black control, while Manfield has elected for, as so many of the players in the field have, red-black aggro. So these two decks operating on different sort of paces, different styles of play. What might we expect to see here in this final deciding game, Simon?
Scarab God. That's what we have to expect. The blue-black deck is actually something that has fallen a bit off the radar, but Martin User is bringing it here also because I think he really likes his matchup against the field, and the blue-black deck is quite scary to play against, I have to say.
Yeah, Scarab God was an all-star at last year's World Championships. This time around, it just seems like that the pace of the format has maybe made life a little bit trickier for utilizing it as a main win condition. But we will see how things play in this final deciding game between these two. Manfield, well experienced in the feature match area, as are, of course, so many of our competitors here. But there aren't too many competitors that have hoisted a world champion trophy.
Yeah, so for this game 3, if you know how white-blue control plays out, the blue-black control has actually a very similar early and mid-game, but then the late game is different. Instead of relying on Teferi, blue-black is playing 4 Torrential Gearhulks to flashback those Rascus Contempts you see in Juice's hand, and then 2 Scarab Gods. And once you start getting back Gearhulks with the Scarab God, it's really all over.
So Duress being played here by Manfield. Both of these decks have a lot of disruption if they need to after sideboarding. And here he will be able to take a non-creature permanent out of, non-creature, non-land permanent, should I say, out of Martin User's hand. He sees the Scarab God. He cannot take that, but there are plenty of other good options available to him here. Let's see which one he ends up going for. Vraska's Contempt, there is Fatal Push in there. Supreme Will is a great one to know about. It will be interesting to see quite where he wants to deploy this duress.
Martin needs to draw lands. This is his biggest concern at the moment. This Supreme Will First needs an island, and then it's probably also being used to get a land. Once you reach 4 mana with this hand, you can be quite happy because you get to Wrath's Contempt.
User there, he just sits on and waits as Seth comes to a conclusion as to what he wants to take here. At this point, all agency in the hand of the #1 ranked player in the world. And it's really interesting to see a deck list that we've described as aggro having so much versatility that even against a control deck, it can play these controlling sorts of options here, stripping cards out of its opponent's hand. Ultimately, Fatal Push being the card that gets taken away there, because that's one of the relatively few cards in User's hand that he can actually cast.
Yeah, and User is bottlenecked on mana, so Seth wants to get his advantage in the early game. Maybe dropping a 2-drop here, 1-drop even.
Now, I believe that User did draw a land for his turn. He played the Field of Ruin that Seth had seen, masking the fact that he might actually not be quite as badly off for mana as it first appeared. Torrential Gear helped them pick up there, but already got a blue-black land available. He's going to take some hits here from this Bomat Courier, but it's not really until the Courier has 3, maybe 4 cards under it and a more depleted hand for Manfield that its ability gets really interesting.
Yeah, and Seth also needs to empty his hand to really make use of the Courier's ability.
Dragon Skull Summit, meaning 3 mana available for Seth here. His mana base pretty much perfect at this point, but Doomfall, another way of stripping cards out of Martin User's hand. And the fact that it gets to exile a card from the hand, potentially meaning that even the likes of Recursion from Martin User will not get him anywhere.
Tricky spot here because User has Supreme Will mana available. You can counter, you can try to find a land, which I think is the right play here. Like I was mentioning, if you hit 4 lands with this kind of draw, you are actually very happy.
And that's exactly what's happened there. So that one of the only cards that cannot be taken from Martin User's hand here. Ultimately, when discard starts hitting lands, that's the point that it gets really, really miserable and unfun play experience, particularly. So not something you really see in this day and age in the game.
And this is where it comes down back to the turn 1 play of Duress. If you play against white-blue control and you're Duress, you can actually take those Teferis that are the most scary cards because you're going to lose to them. But User with his deck choice has the Scarab God and Torrential Gearhulk, and it's almost impossible for Manfield to get rid of all of those late-game creature-based finishers.
So 2 copies of Vraska's Contempt, 1 Torrential Gearhulk, 1 Scarab God, and a land there in hand for Martin User. And again, Seth Manfield just figuring out what he wants to do. You see him taking notes there. This is allowed. You are allowed to give yourself a little bit of a reminder as to what's in your opponent's hand going forward, and he will be referring to that throughout the rest of this game. That one of the values of having all this discard, you just get so much more information, and when you're a player of Seth's caliber, that information a very big deal.
Yeah, and basically, this was once again a very difficult decision. If you go with the initial idea that I'm taking your Fatal Push to win the early game, win the mid game to some extent, then taking a removal spell would be the right choice. But picking one of the Wrath's Contempt when there is already another one in User's hand and those super scary 5 and 6 drops, Manfield really had a tough choice there.
So here comes Goblin Chainwhirler. This is not really a matchup where the Chainwhirler can expect to do more than be a 3/3 first striker for 3. Even the first strike, not super relevant. Still an efficient body, though, not one that's quick to remove from the deck after sideboarding for Seth Manfield.
It is at its worst here. The turn 1 Swamp didn't help, and the fact that the ability is effectively irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, the 1 damage to an opponent and Planeswalkers sometimes does something, but ultimately the main thing here, just a warm body. Vraska's Contempt dealing with that Bomat Courier while there's not access to red mana for it to be sacrificed, even if Seth so wanted.
It's very unlikely, almost never happens that the red-black aggro deck has 1 mana open and cannot activate Bomat Courier, but User just found the right spot here.
The Scarab God in play, and another Duress here. Syncopate alongside that Vraska's Contempt. Nice to know about the Syncopate especially. It means that there's the potential to play around it. It's not always going to be a hard counter. And we'll see whether or not he wants to double down on taking off these Vraska's Contempts or making sure that he's not going to face counter magic in the next turn.
I don't think you want to face that Vraska's Contempt when you don't have that much pressure. But Seth has been playing like he is actually holding another Doomfall, because he allowed User to tap out for the Scarab God. You don't want to allow User to untap with it.
Yeah, so far we've only seen Doomfall as a way of dealing with cards in hand, but of course it can also force an opponent to exile a creature that they have in play, and getting that Scarab God into exile is exactly what you want to be doing in this matchup, because if it goes to the graveyard, it can come back. From exile, well, there's no coming back from that. Martin User here, he's had his hand absolutely ripped to shreds by this red-black aggro list, and even though it's only really now that Seth Manfield's attacking, that's not really important. It doesn't need to be that the red-black list is being very aggressive. Sometimes it just needs to make sure that the best answers of opponents are taken away first.
Yeah, and Seth is playing very smartly here. He has a current sign of Urza in hand, but knows about the Vraska's Contempt, so he's exposing his lesser threats, his Goblin Chain Whirlers, and he knows that because Yuza doesn't have anything else, he will be forced to use the removal on one of the Chain Whirlers.
Yeah, one Chain Whirler briefly came into play but was dealt with by Vraska's Contempt. Khan, Sign of Urza there, stopped before it even came into play thanks to Negate. User he's kind of doing the right thing at this stage in the game, but unfortunately he's not been able to deploy as many spells or threats or answers as he really wanted in the early stages, meaning that he's taking a lot of damage from this Chain Whirler. Yes, there's a way of a counter magic there for Chandra Torch of Defiance, but he had to find that Scarab God right there in order to make sure that he wasn't just going to be cold to this Goblin.
But that's a huge top deck. That's exactly what he needed. He was looking at a 2 or 3 turn lethal. He had a few counters, but he didn't have an answer to the board. And suddenly he draws the second Scarab God. He's only playing 2.
And the interesting thing here about this Scarab God, obviously very powerful indeed. We're in kind of a weird spot where almost all the creatures that have been dealt with, in fact, possibly indeed all of them, have been exiled, meaning that the middle ability on that Scarab God to be able to get back creatures from the graveyard, that much more difficult here. Scrap Heap Scrounger coming down for Seth Manfield. He's got plenty of creatures on the battlefield, but you can see there, he's had to pump the brakes. There's no way of really meaningfully attacking through this Scarab God.
Wow, this is a crazy back and forth. The Seth has suddenly 9 power on the board, and he has to just go for it.
Yeah, this is threatening lethal, this attack. While ultimately Martin User, in a longer game with more life, could have killed off a creature, got it back from the graveyard. That was an attack for exactly lethal. Had to extend the hand. Seth Manfield picking up the win there. And after a slightly tricky phase in the draft stages of things, he now beginning to potentially turn it around with his constructive matchup. And we're going to get a chance to see the deciding game for these players. It will be this game that decides whether or not going into round 6 they are on a positive or a losing record here. We have in the hands of Wyatt Darby, we've seen a fair amount of it. This is red-black aggro. On the other side of things though, Brad Nelson, he is on Aetherflux Reservoir Combo.
Are we good?
These guys, they've been very patiently waiting to be able to start this off. We wanted to make sure that we could bring you just as much magic as possible here. So after sideboarding, they just kept on pause here so that we could make sure that we got a chance to see their decider.
Fair enough. Okay. Then my math was off, so yeah.
They're just double-checking the amount of time left on the match for them. Obviously, very important to make sure that that pause doesn't mean to say that they're going to miss out on any minutes, but we are going to be able to start them off. And I'm sure we'll make sure that these guys are not penalized at all for that wait. You can see our feature match area gradually clearing out here. Some of these standard rounds can go very quickly indeed, the red-black decks. We call them red-black aggro in part because they do have that ability to just close out games very quickly when they get the right combination of draws, the old 1, 2, 3 going on. So we're going to be starting at 32 minutes, which is when the clock was stopped here. And we will, of course, get that updated for you so that you can follow along in terms of timings just as well.
Can't imagine us using that.
Yeah, I mean, I love a good tank.
Yeah, at the same time, you could hear the players right there. They don't expect to be using the 32 minutes rather than, I don't know what they were given initially, 28 or 30, but it's still correct to point it out.
Jalfa and Void there on turn 1 from Brad Nelson. This one of the few non-island lands in his deck, but it does mean that he gets the opportunity to get a little bit of a scry on with a land, and he's not really punished for having a few non-blue sources in his list, while his deck is almost exclusively islands on the lands. Ultimately, most of his spells are actually artifacts.
Yeah, and actually starting with the Void doesn't mean that there are no islands in Nelson's hand at all. It's just if you know your mana situation is good enough that you don't need colored mana as much, you can just start with it to get the Scry bonus as soon as possible.
But when
Quite a start.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about the aggro draw from these red black lists, 1-drop attacker, 2-drop attacker, on turn 3 a Doomfall to potentially stymie some of the early start from Brad Nelson. We can see Sai in hand. There's Mox Amber to work with there as well. I mean, this hand looks pretty decent for Brad, but it may be that he finds that it's a little bit too slow, given that Wyatt on the play has got these early aggressors. Yeah,
Darby's start is amazing, and this is the reason why Red Black is so good. He's actually looking at a turn 4 Chandra if he top decks a land, but at the same time, that Sai was also quite scary. Sai, Mox Amber, Trigger, we've seen that before, maybe an Ornithopter, and now Brad has to play, let's say, his regular game plan of going for the combo while under pressure.
Yeah, we did see a little bit of extra card drawing options there with Reverse Engineer, the Ornithopter and Mox Amber able to act as mana sources there thanks to the improvise naturally on Reverse Engineer. But all of this is Brad Nelson kind of treading water. He's just doing what he needs to do to try and draw into the cards he needs. Meanwhile, Wyatt Darby, he's just getting to attack in, and Brad Nelson already at 10 needs to be a little bit worried here.
A little bit worried is a good point, because this is 8 points of power on the battlefield, which means Chandra is lethal. Chandra comes down, deals 2, and Cruise Heart of Kiran. Not a lot of cards are lethal in the spot, but Chandra is the one to be scared of.
So Nelson just figuring out what he wants to do on this turn. Yes, there's an Ornithopter in play. When Ornithopter is your best hope as a blocker, quite frankly, the situation is close to hopeless.
So I think Brad will use a little bit of the clock time right here, because this is one of these crucial turns where he has to look at his hand and say, how do I craft a game plan that gives me the best chance at winning?
So playing Inspiring Statuary there, yes, it cost him 3 mana, but in point of fact, when it comes to casting that commit that he has in hand to stop a key threat from Wyatt Darby, it was essentially free, because he's still going to have 4 mana available to cast a colored spell here.
And Darby actually top decks the untapped land here. Has the Chandra in hand, you can see it there.
Yeah, Darby very unlikely to resolve this Chandra, but in the meantime, he could just maybe play things a little bit more cagey, get some smaller attacks in, and still in fantastic shape here.
The thing is, he needs to deploy something first if he wants to make maximum use of the Heart of Kiran. And I don't see how that's not Chandra.
Darby very carefully figuring out what he wants to do on this battlefield. Goes for Chandra, and we're going to see some responses here from Brad Nelson. There is Commit, the Planeswalker getting put down into Wyatt Darby's deck. But you can see there Bomat Courier, meaning that Chandra would naturally be picked up a little bit more quickly from the top of the deck from Wyatt Darby, as the little letter bug there putting a card from the top of Darby's deck into exile.
Brad bought himself some breathing room here. But that breathing room just means maybe one more turn than he would have had.
A very difficult spot for the former Player of the Year here, up against a Pro Tour champion from this very season in the form of Wyatt Darby, and a Pro Tour champion playing arguably the best deck in the format here. Prophetic Prism drawing a card from Nelson as he tries to dig his way to victory here. Functionally 7-ish mana, depending on how many colored spells available to Brad Nelson to work with. What is he going to be looking for here to stay in this game?
I think Sai to survive would be the best way of ensuring that he doesn't die next turn. And then at some point, I think we have to look at a flashback of like the aftermath of memory. Not this turn. I'm expecting that next turn after Nelson has survived combat. Is that Sai?
Yes, it is. All right. If there's going to be a way of Brad Nelson staying in this game, this is the line that we picked out as having his best chance of helping him get to victory. That Mox Amber now does tap for blue mana. Functionally doesn't change the number of mana available to Brad Nelson if he's casting colored spells, but does affect the quality of it just a little bit. And here we see Brad using a couple of mana to sacrifice some artifacts to draw more cards. We can see that this is a desperation zone. Another Mox Amber here generating a token and indeed helping his mana situation just a little bit.
And he knew he wanted to cast that Mox Amber, so wanted to spend the mana meaningfully.
Another Prophetic Prison, draws another card, generates another Thopter, passes things back. It's possible here that Brad Nelson has bought himself the turn that he needed. Glorybringer on the top of the deck, though, does represent a lot more damage here.
Yeah, and Brad also, he cannot afford to take damage. He also cannot afford to lose too many artifacts, because suddenly Paradoxical Outcome and Memory are getting weaker.
Yeah, 2 cards in hand.
Just an abundance of good options available to Wyatt Darby for his future turns in terms of the damage that he can represent.
Don't forget those, what is it, 6 cards soon to be under Bowmat Courier?
Oh yeah, wow. At some point he just gets to win all of his money back with that Bowmat Courier. Not too often that you see that many cards exiled to a Bowmat Courier without it either getting killed off or just simply used at some point for all those cards. Chandra just resolving very straightforwardly the second time around. Kicks things off by killing off Sai.
I like this. Just don't take any chances here. You could go for 2 damage to the dome, but letting Brad untap with a Sai in play and Memory in the graveyard is not a good way to victory. Oh, this is the spot where you shouldn't be hesitating. You should have known what to do with your Chandra when you played her.
Yeah, Wyatt Darby, you can see here what he's second guessing is by using Chandra to crew Hearts of Kiran, he is throwing away a very potent threat, but in the meantime threatening a lot of damage this very turn. And that does mean that Brad Nelson going to be forced into activity to try and stop at least some of the damage that's heading across from the other side of things.
No attack with Bowmat Courier, doesn't want to expose that to a block, even though it would have meant that he dealt 3 damage to Brad.
Brad throwing away a couple of Thopter tokens. In many respects, he's in a similar position, if not slightly worse, to where he was last turn when we said he needs Sai plus some action. What can he find now to be able to stay in this game?
He has the Inspiring Statuary, so this is a card that is not to be underestimated with Memory in the graveyard. But it is spinning the wheel. It is just saying, let's see what I can find.
Memory, each player shuffling their hand in and drawing 7 cards. I mean, you're granting a lot of cards to Wyatt Darby. Wyatt, with 4 mana to work with, doesn't need to do too much to find this final 5 points of damage, even though this red-black aggro list doesn't tend to run lots of burn spells that can be sent straight to the face. There are, you know, haste creatures. There are so many ways that he can just develop his board still further and just compound the problems that Brad Nelson finds himself facing.
Chandra, cut to ribbons. There are some cards that you have to be aware of.
As things stand, the best hope for Brad Nelson at this point is to rely on Memory. Brad Nelson there pointing out that Sai not getting shuffled in because that one got dealt with by Doomfall, so it was in exile. Only the graveyard getting shuffled in thanks to Commit to Memory. These players, they were always shuffling up, drawing 7. Typically the sort of thing you do at the start of a game, but when you do it mid-game, it can either work out very, very well if you've got the mana to do future things afterwards, or very bad. Very much time left in terms of turns for Nelson if he's going to find the victory here. The amount of virtual mana available to him thanks to Improvise and those lands, not enough that he can reasonably expect to do a big combo this turn. It's just a matter of setting himself up to be able to use all of those permanents in future turns to maybe achieve something.
If he finds a Sai and can cast 2-3 artifacts in the same turn, that would be tremendous for his chances to survive.
All right, well, let's see exactly what he's working with here. Looks like there's a paradoxical outcome to play with, but unfortunately in this instance, drawing those extra cards, he's not necessarily going to be able to do much with them. I mean, yes, he could replay Ornithopters as blockers and so on and so forth, but it's going to be a rough old ask.
No Sai to be seen. Another Ornithopter, so maybe that the secret to surviving one more turn?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you have 2 Ornithopters, you get to cast your paradoxical outcome for 2 mana, then replay those Ornithopters, and you've drawn potentially a few cards. You get to reset your Mox Amber that can potentially cast more colored spells thanks to Inspiring Statuary. It's not all over.
Well, I was thinking about passing the turn and blocking, like just saying, if you can kill me, that's fine, but I'm gonna risk it here. I'm gonna try to block with my Ornithopters. This Reservoir Combo deck is not easy to play. It's really intricate.
And ultimately very rewarding for someone who's got time and motivation, and both of those things really sum up some of the reasons that Brad Nelson is one of the best players in the world. He's willing to devote the time that he needs to really getting to grips with any deck in Standard, and has one of the best reputations as a player of this format of anyone on the planet. Two Ornithopters and a pass there from Brad Nelson. So let's see what Wyatt Darby's working with, because suddenly he gets to reap the rewards of his opponent casting Memory. He has a whole new grip of 7 cards to work with, and if he's got, you know, just some removal for those creatures, it might be enough for him to just close out this game here.
Removal for the creatures. Glory Bringer is huge. Anything with haste, really. Chandra still an issue, but Heart of Kiran doesn't crew itself. So there is hope for Brad, who has navigated this game to a point where he's fighting for every single extra turn that he's getting, but he's always threatening to just go off out of nowhere.
Nelson, he's effectively F6'd here. He basically has to just hope that there's not going to be a really big turn coming from his opponent. Wyatt Darby, he's the one with all of the action on him here. He's got a couple of copies of Duress in hand, so in principle, if he can't find the win here, he may be able to stymie what's going on Brad Nelson's side of things, but it seems pretty likely he's going to be swinging for the fences if he's going to be able to do so, and there is a Glory Bringer available to him this turn.
Difficult choice, actually, because you really want to fire off those Duresses, but then you're not threatening lethal.
Glory Bringer being held above the battlefield here. Does Brad Nelson have a way of interacting with it?
So, as far as I can see, if the Glory Bringer exerts and Darby animates, crews the Heart of Kiran, he has exactly 5 points of damage coming through. So he's not punished for not attacking with Barmaid Courier earlier. He would be attacking for exactly lethal.
So already we've seen this Heart of Kiran getting crewed by Scrap Heap Scrounger. 3 damage from the ground creature turning into 4 damage in the air from that vehicle.
Yep.
Everybody.
Everyone's coming in, and the exert does mean that one of those Ornithopters is likely to be removed before we have any blockers to be declared. Nelson extends the hand. Wyatt Darby picks up the win there, advancing to 3-2 in this World Championship. It has been a bit of a rough ride for the players who've elected to go against the grain with regards to this powerful red-black aggro deck. Red-black aggro has been doing good work in these early stages. We saw Ken Yukihiro's mono-blue list falling to it last round. The mono-blue list from Brad Nelson ultimately succumbing to it in this round 5 here. So it's been a little bit of a rough spot. Of course, still plenty more rounds of play. And one unusual thing about this tournament, if we were talking about a Pro Tour, picking up that 3rd loss so early in the tournament would seem like it's lights out, it's all over. That's not really the way that it works here. We've got so few players in this field that there's still every potential for anyone at this stage in the tournament to go on a big run and ultimately finish top of the Swiss and potentially have the advantage when it comes to the Final 4 of even having the option of whether to go first or second.
It's very important not to get disheartened if you are at 3 losses, 4 losses, because you can still rattle off these wins and find yourself in the top 4.
Yeah, big plays for these guys, and they will, of course, now be just recentering, refocusing. There are plenty more rounds of Magic to be playing. We hope that wherever you are around the world, you will stay with us for these World Championships here in Las Vegas, Nevada. We'll have more Magic for you after these messages.